Welcome to the Recovery.com podcast. I'm Dr. Mala, and today I'm joined by fellow host Cliff McDonald. Hi, Cliff. How are you?
Hey, Dr. Mala, I'm
Of
great. Thanks
course,
for
of
having me
course.
here.
Today, we're so thrilled to welcome Athena Phillips, a social worker and founder of the Integrative Trauma Treatment Center. And with over 25 years of experience in behavioral health, she brings a really progressive and compassionate approach to trauma therapy and focuses on human resilience and strength. I'm so excited to welcome you. Welcome, Athena.
Thank you, Dr. Mulla and Cliff, for having me.
Of course. So we'll dive right in. And the first question I want to ask is, what was your why? You've been in, behavioral health since 1995 and working with diverse populations. What drew you to this work?
Oh, gosh. I mean, probably like many people, I have my own history, and history helps me relate to the history of others and the way it manifests in their day to day life. And I think that having something in your background that helps you relate also helps you remain compassionate and connected to those you're serving. So I have my own impetus that's rooted in history, but also I have just loved watching people become the best versions of themselves through our work together. And I don't see myself as a healer. I think that people heal themselves, but it is truly an honor to be alongside people as they do that work and to be a support throughout the process. So my why is just rooted in the human capacity, not just for resilience, but for so many other beautiful facets of
Yeah,
being a
yeah.
human.
You've done so much work with disabled children and adults, and also globally. You've done this work globally. I'd love to hear more about that. And also, I know you've done work in Rwanda, right?
Yeah, so I guess going back to the beginning of my career, I worked with people with developmental disabilities for a good 15 years. And there were periods, well, and it still kind of overlaps. I still have some clients with developmental disabilities that I work with and have for many years. But truly, if you want to talk about inspiration, this is an inspiring group of folks, where we were able to do so many fun things together and really, if you want to see somebody who can overcome just sort of basic barriers, not to mention emotional ones or more complex ones, people with disabilities, developmental disabilities, truly inspired me and taught me a lot about how to wait for somebody to try, allow somebody to fail so that they can ultimately be successful. And that's sort of what a lot of my
Mhm.
work is rooted in that population, or that population provided that for me or to me. And then after doing that work for a long time, I went back to school, and I did know that I wanted a specialization in trauma. And so I've spent a lot of time and energy learning as much as I possibly could over the past decades, and I just don't get bored. It's just so interesting, and things continue to change and evolve. But one of the things, part of my own history is pretty significant impoverishment. And I know what it's like to need something that you can't have, or just the basics, just needing the
Mhm.
basics, food, shelter, etc. So not to mention mental health care, or something that would otherwise seem luxurious to somebody who needs to walk to their treatment or doesn't have any other way to access it financially or geographically. And so one of the things I'm really passionate about is accessibility to supports. And it may be therapy, it may be coaching, but I believe that innovation is the key to expanding access to care. And so I had been going to Rwanda for, I think I went probably 8 years in a row to facilitate a cross-cultural exchange on what trauma looks like and what's common, what's different in terms of how we address it. And through my partnerships in Rwanda, I've supported them and my colleagues there in creating their own clinic, so that they can serve their population. And truthfully, Rwanda's an inspiring, I call it a beacon of hope, because they really went through it and came out on the other side more connected than ever. So that's a strong lesson learned for me, and that kept me going back. But also, I had so much to learn from my colleagues there, and I'm so grateful for the relationships. And now we did a trauma coach training there last February, and that was really beautiful and enriching. And again, cross-cultural learning that was really meaningful to me and my colleagues that attended. So I continue to have my relationships with folks there, and continue to look forward to visiting
That's
and working
amazing.
together.
Tell me, and also for our audience, like, what does trauma coaching involve? What does it entail?
I wrote my own trauma coaching course. I kind of vacillate between creating content that's highly accessible to people who are paraprofessionals, to offering really advanced trainings like in working with dissociative disorders, and but both are rooted in the same thing, and that is, again, accessibility to information that will help us support our communities be healthier and happier. So coaching, I know that sometimes people get their feathers ruffled about coaching, and I can understand why. And that's why, as a therapist, I created something that if I'm working with a coach alongside my client, I know what I'm going to want the coach to do and what I want myself to do and what I want the client to do. And coaches can fill this gap of, well, not fill, it's not a gap really, but sort of take some of the pressure off the therapist in the early stages of trauma work. And that is providing support around skill building, emotion regulation skills, building relationship, having, I call them bridge appointments. So, like, if I'm doing trauma work, I'm going to
Mhm.
dysregulate my
Mhm.
client. I know that. And my client knows that, but I can't be there to support them in the way that I would like for them to be supported. So coaches can offer bridge appointments, supportive bridge appointments when we're doing that heavy lifting with clients. So really it's present and future oriented work, whereas the therapist can lean into the past. And then we work together as a team to support the client through that work, hopefully condensing it and getting it done quicker. So the amount of time spent suffering has gotten smaller.
Oh, no,
I
that's
hope that was
great.
clear.
Yeah, that's interesting. Athena, you mentioned something earlier that really resonated with me. I've done a fair amount of coaching in a business capacity, in athletic capacity. I've been coached. I am someone in long-term recovery, and I used the 12-step program, and I got really, really lucky with a wonderful sponsor, which is essentially a coach. You said you don't identify as a healer, and you talked about that has to come from within somehow. Maybe you're the facilitator or the guide. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, right? Like, what has to happen with the individual? Is that sudden and spectacular? The lights go on? Is it more gradual? I'm fascinated with that. Like, when do you see that turn? And you've got a big data set here, so I'd love to hear you speak about that.
Maybe one of the gifts in being, like, I like to lean into Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. I'm a nurturing guide, basically, where I'm standing alongside and I'm offering support that's consistent and predictable. And I'm also noticing strengths more than weaknesses. And the more, it's this cycle of reflection where I can see, wow, you've got this superpower. Most of the time, we don't know what our superpowers are because we're standing too close to the mirror. So I can highlight the superpower and then help cultivate leaning into it, then leaning into the things that are creating or causing distress. So one of the things that I do is just focus and highlight repeatedly without over complimenting or anything. But this is something that you could do. Like, you got this far without me or anybody else. So I know you can go further. And I'm right here beside you. But it doesn't typically feel like a big light bulb. I mean, sometimes we have catharsis, sometimes we have light bulbs, but mostly it feels very quiet and consistent. And I like to nurture that pacing because it's more sustainable than some big aha, in my opinion. We're kind of building infrastructure and supporting slow but
Yeah,
long-term growth.
that, I mean, oh, sorry.
Yeah,
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say
go ahead.
you referenced Joseph Campbell, one of my favorites, and like from what it sounds like is you're really encouraging the individual to find and connect with their own hero, right? And then embrace that journey, which is so beautiful. Cliff, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Same, and I studied psychology as an undergrad, and I did not a full program at Penn, but I did part of that positive psychology program there as a certificate program. and Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell, and then the Values in Action Institute of identifying your character strengths. I think most people who have gone through substance use disorder and have achieved recovery, I think it's safe to say you have crossed the threshold
Yeah.
and gone to the other world, and then you came back, hopefully with an elixir. And when I was reading these things, what it helped with so much was just an identification with the human condition, right? And this is something that we all can plant our own experience into this in some way, shape, or form. And I think what that does, and I rely on you two, the clinicians, it makes you feel like you're not alone,
Yeah.
right? But having a professional help you see it through that lens, like this is normal.
Mm-hmm.
That this is a journey that everyone goes on in different ways. Is that the approach? Is that kind of the approach, that this is a fairly normal experience? It's specialized and kind of customized for you, but is that
How I approach everything is normalization of the human experience, even if it's, vastly diverse. The diversity is also humanizing, but being rooted in thinkers like Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell specifically, that archetypal connection, like this interwoven connection that they talk about, highlights the fact that we're connected to ourselves, we're connected to our ancestors, and we're not reinventing the wheel. This is not, it's nothing new. So even if our experience feels like a departure, we're still interconnected on a really deep and unknown level. And that's what I find really inspiring about their work. And it helps me continue to normalize the experience of those I'm working with.
I got some really, really tough coaching early in recovery, and I'll share that because it was really effective. I think I thought I was special, probably some ego involved with that. And Athena, as I mentioned, I grew up in Boston, and I had a guy there who was really helping me with a strong Boston accent. He said, "Kid, you're nothing but a garden variety alcoholic." And he was trying to help me to see that you just have this thing that a lot of other people have. That's it. And that provided relief.
Oh, yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I can see both.
Right? Right?
Not unique, but
Yeah.
at the same time.
Because a lot of people come into those rooms thinking they're unique, they're special, they're different. And there's always intricacies, of course. But it was interesting that that kind of connection with this experience that lots of other people across time and place have experienced provided relief. It's interesting.
Absolutely.
You talk about storytelling, Athena. I'd love for you to expand on that a little bit more and explain that, of course, for our audience as well, and share your experiences there.
Yeah. So one of the ways that we're trying to introduce learning on our continuing education platform is connecting to the content through storytelling. A PowerPoint provides a lot of information, but we walk away with no context often. We all love vignettes and little pieces, but really the real story, really rich stories highlight all the things that we're trying to capture in a PowerPoint or something. So one, I don't want learning to be boring, but also I want it to be really connective and to connect us across cultures, across borders, all the things. So one of the storytelling episodes we did was on Rwanda, which again, obviously an inspiration to me, but we did a learning through storytelling documentary style film that talked about what the key components are, or the key ingredients that Rwanda has that helped the culture recover from the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. And there were things pre-colonialism that the culture had that they relied upon as part of their healing and their trauma-informed recovery on a large scale. And those pieces of information are things that I feel like the rest of the world would really benefit from. So I rely on stories as a way to help us connect to the content and the information we're providing, but also to provide a rich learning opportunity for folks.
Yeah. What can you share that are highlights? What are the highlights from some of those learning moments and milestones that you were able to discover?
Oh gosh. I mean, first of all, what an opportunity to even be able to
Yeah.
ask the questions. And that came out of having established relationships with people, with professionals there in Rwanda. So I feel very lucky to have had the opportunity and that there was enough trust in me to, to complete the project. So that's thing one. But one of the, I guess, a really solid example that always inspires me is that before colonialism, Rwanda had something called the Gacaca courts. And those were community-based courts. Gacaca means a field of grass because people would sit on a field of grass and sort of hash it out. It was a very intimate form of justice. And because of the number of both perpetrators and victims that came out of the genocide, the contemporary court system was not well suited to handle all of the justice that needed to be pursued. So they went back to Gacaca. And this was an opportunity for survivors to directly confront the perpetrators and to be face to face with them with the embrace of their community and to share the effects of what they did with the perpetrator. But also perpetrators of genocidal violence in Rwanda, there's a plan for release and for reintegration. So we're not perpetuating trauma through incarceration. And we're reintegrating into the community even after these horrific things happen. So the intimacy of that system was a huge part of the healing process. So we got to hear some stories about the way that survivors were impacted by that particular approach. So they did go back to using the contemporary court system, but Gacaca was a big part of healing.
Phenomenal. What were some of the challenges that you encountered? I'm imagining there were a few, but what challenges did you encounter when starting to integrate the mental health support in and even become part of that process of healing that you're describing?
Well, I would first start by saying I was in the back seat. It's not really my place to be providing care or treatment to people in Rwanda. I'm not Rwandan. So rather, the way I viewed it was that my role was to share information and to have an exchange with colleagues, and they have so much to teach me as well. So there's that. But there are obviously, in terms of garnishing information, or rendering information, that was tricky because there are two cultures communicating with each other about a really delicate topic and a really painful experience. So, and just logistically, that's difficult because there are language barriers. And one of the cultural nuances in Rwanda is that they speak very quietly and Americans are pretty loud. So even just navigating volume, and I feel like, can you hear each other? Because you talk so quietly, but they can hear each other just fine. It's just, I needed to adapt my listening and even level up my listening skills there, which is always a good lesson for a listener, a professional listener. Listening was one of the things, but also just trying to understand cultural nuances around power, like what my role is and how to be humble, but also honor the hierarchy that Rwanda typically, the cultural hierarchy in terms of what your role is professionally and things like that. So for me, navigating, I want to be humble and I want to learn from you and I want to have a place, but also if I'm a professional, they're going to put me in on a certain platform there. So that was a little bit, just negotiating that was a little bit more challenging. Mostly though, it wasn't too hard.
Yeah.
It's just, they're just so lovely and welcoming and adaptable, all of those things.
That's
so
great.
Yeah.
When you came back from Rwanda and back here, and I know you visit frequently, how would you say the time there has informed your approach to culturally sensitive and globally relevant trauma treatment here in the States?
One thing that I've noticed that Western clinicians assume is that approaches over there are going to be dramatically different from Western approaches. And that is not so, because especially in Rwanda, the mental health industry wants to be rooted in evidence-based practices. So they're starting from what is known and then adding to it through their own cultural lens. But we still have the same foundational orientation to mental health care in general. At least I don't want to expand that beyond Rwanda because that's where I did my work. But that's one of the pieces that I learned and that I was surprised by. I thought I would be learning completely different things. But one of the things that I did learn that I just love so much is that there's a great emphasis on
Mm,
community as a component to healing. Whereas, here we have therapy that occurs once a week and it's totally carved out from the rest of your life and separate. Whereas this is far more integrated, and it feels like that provides some fabric that kind of holds the healing together. And there's community investment in the person
mm,
and vice versa. So as a result, there's just sort of this collective elevation in the healing process that exists there that isn't here. So I really want to emphasize community as part of healing for humans, all humans, but even for clinicians. We do so much of our work in
mhm.
isolation, and I don't think that's particularly good for us either. But, that was one of the key features that I pulled from
Yeah, I think, I
Rwanda.
mean, you hit it on the head. That's so important. We talk about, how connection and that sense of community is so important to healing. I know, Cliff, also, you talk about that a lot. You and I even have shared how there's healing through connection that occurs. So that's wonderful to hear that you're reinforcing that and emphasizing that in your work here as well. So that's great. So let's talk a little bit then also about the educational platform. Uh,
KALOS, like
okay, okay,
kaleidoscope.
wonderful. Please share
Yeah.
what KALOS is about, and tell us all
Mhm.
about that.
Well, KALOS is, it is a kaleidoscopic view of mental health, which I'm guessing that that's coming across that it's one of my values, professional values. But we wanted to not just provide training and education, like you can
Mhm.
find that anywhere. We wanted to also provide educational opportunities to people who otherwise don't have them, and to elevate voices that are otherwise
Mm,
silenced or minimized, and to incorporate a variety of approaches to not only solutions around mental health, but defining the problem in and of itself. So we're just beginning to launch, but there are just so many more perspectives we can have on this singular, it's not a singular or simple issue, but this particular challenge that we're all facing. So it's about opportunity, accessibility, and a diversity of approaches to similar problems. And then there's this other piece that we have included, which other platforms don't, and that is having a
mm,
community component. So off of social media, it's moderated. We're offering additional opportunities for skills and for learning from each other, engaging with each other, consultations, etc., all within the community, and that can be complementary to the continuing education opportunities that we offer.
Athena, you've talked about community quite a bit,
Yeah.
and you hear in the West, right, rugged individualism and the self-made man and all of these things. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the effectiveness of group therapy
Mhm.
versus individual therapy with trauma.
It is an interesting question because there is such a reluctance to engage in group work. But we know, and even therapists are reluctant to have their clients do that. But we know that it's at least as effective, if not more, and less accessible, which means it's, or less expensive, which means it's more accessible. So group work, I think, is actually foundational to healing. And then the individual should be complementary. So in my mind, it should be the other way around in terms of how we think about it, because we need each other. That's like the foundation of attachment, right? That we need somebody to see us, to attune to us, to understand us and respond appropriately. And you can get that with one person, sure, but it's a lot more difficult to generalize something from one person versus a community of people. And also just expanding the number of hands and arms that are around us while we go through hard things is obviously going to create a higher level of support. So I really strongly believe in group work as being foundational to moving forward.
Is it fair to say that the biggest challenge with group work early, right, is the lack of willingness or ability to be vulnerable?
Mm.
And I think it's probably different for different groups, different cultures. I know the culture that I'm from, where there is, I think, what a lot of people would say a toxic masculinity kind of element of these kids. They just can't show any weakness, right, or any fear, and they're loaded with fear,
Yes.
right? Do you think that is the big obstacle with group therapy of people just not feeling comfortable being vulnerable? Because I think that's easier if I'm laying down with a therapist one on one. It's a safe space. I'd love your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a couple of things. Then, of course, this is just a hypothesis. But one is I think that being vulnerable and talking about things we're ashamed about or ashamed of requires a certain level of trust and safety. And if you're a traumatized person, trust and safety have already been thrown out the window. So the basics aren't, the foundational sense of safety is not there often for trauma survivors, especially those who've recovered or experienced things in childhood. So I think there's a lot of fear in group work. And then, especially in the States, I think that there's a pursuit of uniqueness, that we all want to feel unique and special. And it's harder to do that in a group. You know, you're sort of competing with other people to be unique and special. And that's one of the things that I'm just noticing. And hopefully that's not offensive to anybody, but that, you know, we don't feel important if we're not really seen, and people feel less visible in group settings sometimes. Along with what you said, of course, that you got to be tough and you can't show, especially for men, that you can't show emotion. You have to be a leader. You just got to be on your own kind of thing, you know. So some of that is
Yeah, you see, you hear these terms, right? Like our secrets keep us sick and suffer in silence and all these things. And the approach that I've seen work in my limited personal involvement with group therapy is mostly 12-step meetings. And the sponsor sponsee relationship, a really good sponsor doesn't tell, doesn't preach, doesn't coach. She shares.
yeah,
Here's how afraid I was. And then you can see the I think Carl Rogers might be congruence, but like let me share my experience and how horrible I was and how afraid I was and the things that happened to me, and then you see I think that on the receiving end there's identification and similarity,
yeah.
and
Which
then
equals
maybe a willingness, right?
yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. And who doesn't love that?
yeah. I think it took me a long time personally to realize that I think I came out as a humanist. And I, right, I think a lot of people, if you think back, like remember when you're a really, really young person and you meet someone new, and that person is your immediate friend and brother and sister. I think that's natural for really young people, right? And isn't that what a humanist really is? Are we taught that that's not the way we're supposed to be? I don't know. I might be a little bit too idealistic here, but
I'm thinking not.
yeah. Well, good, good. It's better to think that way, isn't it?
Yeah.
Great. That's great. So, with the Integrative Trauma Treatment Center, tell me about some of your visions for progressive care and how that's kind of led to the foundation of it, but also how you see that evolving.
Yeah, I started ITTC in 2012. I like to say the year before Bessel van der Kolk published his book. But what I was noticing in private practice, I specialized in trauma and dissociative disorders. And what I was seeing a lot of is that, well, number one, it was showing up in the body, of course. And number two, my clients were very reluctant to go to yoga, to go get a massage, to go do the things that are available. These are the gifts of the West, right? We've got all this stuff available, but they didn't want to go because people made mistakes and they were activated and dysregulated or re-traumatized. So I wanted to create a space where my clients knew that their providers were going to be trauma informed and careful. Trauma informed wasn't a word yet or a phrase yet at that time, but
Yeah.
you get the gist. But I wanted them to have autonomy over their care as much as we could offer, and have a variety of choices, and also ensure that the providers knew about how trauma shows up in the room and knew how to deal with it in a safe way. So that was the why behind the what. And then we've had a variety of different kinds of providers available at ITTC over the years, including massage therapists, acupuncturists. We still have yoga, sometimes Reiki, and none of these things are for everybody, but they're all for somebody. So we just continue to provide as much creativity and inclusivity around choice and opportunities for different types of healing, like creative writing. We do a poetry group, just a lot of things that bring people together and cultivate community, again, because that's important. But really, it's about diversity of options within ITTC.
Love that. That's great. What do you see for the future? What are you hoping for? What do you envision?
I hope that there are a lot of barriers to accessing these kinds of services. And of course, this is pie in the sky, but it would be nice if there was a way for the majority of people to have access to complementary services. So if I have a client, we've seen some incredible things using acupuncture and massage and things like that. Things that I did not expect to see when I work with a massage therapist for a client or something, and then something would come out that I'm not touching the body. I can't do the same things, but the body is the access point for trauma. That's a long way of saying that I would just love there to be more accessibility for different kinds of treatment approaches. Our clinic serves primarily Medicaid folks, so private pay isn't an option for many of them. And I would just like for them to be able to have more robust and well-rounded services for the future.
Have you seen encouraging progress there? Did mental health parity or anything like that help? So we've got different ends of the spectrum, right? Premium, luxury, private pay, the other end, indigent, Medicaid. Because here at Recovery.com, we have seen some exciting progress on the latter with access to care. Have you seen an encouragement there as far as access to different things?
I mean, I would say probably not here anyway, not yet. I hope that maybe as more states and more insurers are willing to cover the cost of some of those things, and we have evidence that it decreases the overarching cost. I hope the same thing for coaching. Like, I agree that we should decrease the overarching cost of treatment and the overarching amount of time that people spend in treatment, because we want them to feel good and be free of their history. But as of now, none of those services are covered by insurance for the most part.
It's just so challenging because the payers aren't going to include it without data. And how can you get the data, right? So it's, the chicken or the egg thing.
Yes,
so we want to support evidence-based care, but you can't have any evidence if you don't try it.
Right. Got to start somewhere.
Right.
Yeah, I guess case studies for the time being, but I'm hoping, fingers crossed.
Could I ask a question a little bit off topic? It's just something I really I think you can teach me, Athena, about. I don't know much about dissociation. I do know that people don't remember their childhood, right? Does dissociation essentially mean kind of lapses, right? Where there isn't full recollection, and is it usually tied to trauma?
Well, dissociation occurs on various levels on a day-to-day basis, like auto-hypnosis. If you're in your car, for example, and then you forget to get off at a certain exit because you're spacing out or whatever, that's just basic dissociation that we all experience, or when we zone out or something like that. And it's kind of like that simple kind is kind of like a break mentally, if you call, that's what it feels like.
Yeah.
And the more exposure we have to adversity or distress, the more separateness we need to rely on to be okay.
Ah, okay.
And then with children, our caregivers are our anchor to reality. And if they're sort of at one point loving and kind and safe and taking care of our needs, and then at another point, and unpredictably, usually children don't know when it will be, they're not predictable and safe, and in fact they're scary. The child needs to learn how to live with both of those very polarized ways of being in a caregiving role.
Sure.
and to be able to adapt and predict. So that separateness is one source of distress, but then they also have this other task of going out in the world and living day to day. So part of them needs to be responsible for that and needs to detach from what's going on at home. So the more adversity there is, the more dissociation there will be, and it's really quite orderly. Actually, it's not disorganized, purposeful, orderly, and intentional, but can be very distressing. And yes, there are gaps in memory, but it's not the way it's shown in the movies where, people just don't remember their entire childhood or don't remember doing something. Yes, that can happen on some level, but there's like a knowing and a not knowing at the same time with structural dissociation specifically.
So that is fascinating. So I'm thinking of a spectrum, right? Like say you talked about impoverishment earlier, where scarcity and abundance, right? Would it be dissociation, mindfulness?
Well, mindfulness helps combat dissociation, because you're focusing on something in the here and now and being present with it, whereas dissociation is a detachment from self, a detachment from the here and now, or a detachment from reality, etc., for a minute, or for whenever you need that detachment. But if you're asking somebody who has experienced chronic adversity throughout childhood to be mindful, that's going to be pretty terrifying sometimes.
Sure.
Because then they're going to be experiencing or remembering all the things they're not ready for. So I use mindfulness really carefully.
So treating someone with severe trauma and dissociation, that there's usually probably triggering activities that will force you into dissociative state, right? And as a clinician, how do you identify when that happens? That must be really hard. But like when do you have those dissociative patterns? How do you do that?
I mean, some of it is recognizing, like going back to the idea of archetypes. These people with dissociative disorders, specifically other specified dissociative disorder or DID, the internal systems, while they're unique to the person and to the demands of their environment, there's a lot of similarities in terms of how they're set up and why they're set up that way. So I can kind of predict what kind of composition there's, and I can predict the internal composition just based on experience, thing one. But also, I think being able to attune to subtleties, because dissociative disorders are disorders of hiding. You're not supposed to know as an observer, and they're not supposed to know as the person. So the history is well hidden from both, but somehow there's this in between that needs to be navigated. And I can help navigate that through really attuning to subtle expressions, whether it be a facial one or a gesture of some kind or something like that.
This requires that work requires a lot of work and experience.
Yeah, there's complexity, but it's a really beautiful population to work with. So inspiring, and nothing like what it's displayed on TV and movies and stuff like that. It's very subtle and really inspiring group of people. Yeah,
Absolutely.
It was a great exploration, and I think for our audience also it might be helpful to define DID. So would you mind doing that and also taking us through, like, what are some of the challenges and opportunities you see in treating DID?
Okay, yes. Well, that's a really conversation. But, so in terms of I'll define both DID and other specified OSDD, just because there's only, for the most part, only one thing differentiating the two. But basically, it's like a family system that lives on the inside. And the more trauma there is, the more phobia there is of other parts, because they're holding information that's terrifying. And parts of self have to do things to help manage the trauma and live life that other parts or self, however you define that, might feel shameful of. And there are different theoretical orientations to this. So I'm describing structural dissociation of the personality. That's one of the orientations I rely upon. But basically, we have parts that interact. Like right now, I am like a professional, the professional part of self. And that may be very different from how I am with my children, if I'm mothering or if I'm out with my friends or something. So we all have parts. But the thing that is different is that trauma pushes them into extreme roles that are rigid, and there's space between them that keeps the separateness. And also, there's a lot of internal conflict between parts of self and how to handle problems of day-to-day life or problems of the past, etc. But DID is really it's an internal family that is very functional, doing things that it needs to do to get through the day-to-day stuff, live life in spite of the past. But there are symptoms of amnesia, day-to-day amnesia, that causes distress. So somebody who says, I forgot, but I don't care, that's not going to be a dissociative disorder. It should be distressing, not should be, but it is distressing and scary. And so you'll see gaps in time. You will see some sort of rigidity around roles for parts of self. And boy, it's complicated to get into all of the details. And then with OSDD, the main difference is there's not day-to-day amnesia for people with OSDD versus DID. And then in terms of opportunity, we really think about this kind of adaptation to adversity. Holy heck, it's really amazing that we have this capacity to split ourselves off into pieces in order to continue to live a life and build a life throughout our life. And so I really think that that's really something that we can learn from as professionals and as people. But also, one of the things that I think dissociative disorders and people with complex trauma have to teach the world is that it's, while accepting the reality of this kind of trauma, because it's truly unimaginable, these are the most traumatized of the traumatized. And their experiences are so beyond what many of us can imagine that it's easier to deny the reality than to address the reality. So we're asking our clients to address their reality when socially at the same time we're denying it. So there is a great deal of resilience and strength that I can see in working with this population that we can generalize to the rest of the world. We all could do it. We all can accept and address these realities and then help each other heal from them. So that's a social opportunity, I suppose. But then there's a lot of room to diagnose sooner. There's a lot of room to provide more efficient treatment and lower the costs and amount of time and care just by starting with assessment and appropriate diagnosis early on.
That's amazing. Athena, when I was thinking of two things, is there a correlation with children who grew up with an alcoholic parent in DID? But then I was also thinking of, severe trauma, as you mentioned, with like veterans and two people that are in the same platoon that have the same experience and they come back very different people, one seemingly better adjusted than the other, and the difference can be vast. Is there any data, like what determines how they react? Like, I would almost guess that it would be those that have higher empathy would be more impacted, right? So I know there's things like twin studies and you look at people in different environments. Is there any good data on what conditions going into the traumatic event leads someone to be more impacted than someone else?
One of the main predictors is prior trauma, past trauma. So, and I kind of think of it like, what is the house built on? Is it built on stilts or is it a concrete? It's a concrete. Whatever the foundation is what you're bringing in to adult traumatic experiences. And we have expectations that are already established that we don't even know we have until they've been till the light's been flicked on when we've been exposed. So, like, if we're assuming that people are going to leave us, and then we go into a situation like what you described and somebody leaves, that's going to be the most painful part of the memory because it's been proven true. And that's a feared truth. And then when it becomes an actual truth, then we have to grieve it. too. So there are a lot of layers that we bring into every situation we're into, but specifically trauma is it can be a direct line, like a conduit. We flip on a light and our past is brought into the present. Our values are highlighted, and especially those that have been violated in the context of trauma, but also fear truths that were proven true in the context of adversity.
It's really fascinating because you could almost think like, well, I've been down this road before, right? I've already been burned. What's another burn? That could be worse than the person that's never been burned before.
Exactly.
That's really interesting.
Yes, that's exactly right.
That's wonderful. Thank you for that description and explanation. So, recovery is, of course, our platform. And, we're Recovery.com. And one of the questions that we ask everyone is, what does recovery mean to you?
Honestly, I think recovery is sometimes saying living our best selves is too much. That's too much pressure. I just want to live in peace. So finding peace and fluidity and flexibility in day-to-day life and having the ability to be in relationship with others in a way that's healthy and enjoyable, and finding balance between work and play, and finding balance between stress and relief. In my opinion, or my experience, recovery for me is that we're comfortable in the world. Doesn't have to be perfect, doesn't have to be the best, but comfortable enough to make the most out of the life that we've been given.
That's great. Well, that's wonderful. Thank you so much.
I've learned so much. This is just, I feel really privileged to be able to be here. I love the nature of the work that you're doing, and I thank you for doing that. Thanks for spending time with us. I hope we get more time with you in the future.
Well, likewise, I really enjoyed it, and I appreciate the work that you're doing. Obviously, a lot of folks in my population really struggle with substance use and substance abuse. That's one of the common themes. So I really am grateful for the work you're doing. And
Thank you. Thank you so much.